Forget the fairy tales about noble knights of the silver screen. Behind the guarded gates of Beverly Hills, a far more transactional reality thrived. In the shadows of manicured hedges and marble foyers, powerful women shaped not only films, but men, molding them, financing them, and, when necessary, diminishing them. What looked like romance in the fan magazines was often a calculated exchange of power. This is one such story.
Robert Taylor. The story of Robert Taylor and Barbara Stanwyck is perhaps one of the clearest examples of how, in Hollywood's golden age, studios and stars didn't just manufacture screen personas, they engineered entire human destinies, sculpted with authority and cold precision. When young Spangler Arlington Brew, who would become Robert Taylor, arrived at the gates of MGM, he was little more than a wide-eyed provincial from Nebraska with a face so striking the camera fell in love with him instantly. But in an industry ruled by predators, beauty alone was a fragile currency. What Taylor lacked was steel, and into that vacuum stepped Barbara Stanwyck. Stanwyck, already a seasoned veteran hardened by a brutal childhood and years of fighting for survival, recognized opportunity when she saw it. Where others saw a handsome newcomer, she saw an investment. Their relationship, polished by the press into one of the era's great love stories, functioned in reality more like a meticulously managed enterprise. Barbara was the architect, Robert was the asset, precious, promising, and entirely dependent. Her influence began with total financial and domestic oversight. At the dawn of his career, when his paychecks were modest and his footing uncertain, she assumed responsibility for virtually everything. She settled his debts, covered his rent, and most crucially, curated his image. It was Stanwyck who fashioned the legend of the gentleman with the perfect profile. She commissioned impeccable suits, refining his appearance until the awkward Midwestern boy vanished behind immaculate tailoring and effortless polish. Under her roof, Robert lived according to her standards. He ate what she approved, wore what she selected, moved through a world she carefully arranged. Comfort, however, came at a price. Stanwyck built a system in which Robert rarely acted without her counsel. She reviewed his MGM contracts herself, occasionally clashing with studio executives, not merely to protect him, but to secure her own influence over his trajectory. In Hollywood's inner circles, it was whispered that Taylor wouldn't so much as order dessert without first glancing toward Barbara for approval. She steered his friendships, shaped his interviews, and subtly erected barriers between him and any potential rival for his loyalty. Dependence became structure, structure became habit. Their marriage in 1939 resembled less a spontaneous declaration of love than a strategic consolidation, an alignment that satisfied both studio optics and personal ambition. Robert, gentle by nature and inclined to follow rather than lead, gradually began to feel the weight of such vigilant guidance. Yet disentanglement proved elusive. Stanwyck held not only his practical affairs, but increasingly his confidence. Through steady persuasion, she impressed upon him that without her connections and instincts, he might remain merely a handsome placeholder, vulnerable to the industry's swift cruelty. The most subtle humiliation lay in how she displayed him in public life. At premieres and private dinners, Robert stood at her side like a flawless emblem, evidence of her discernment, her influence, her success. When he enlisted during the Second World War, determined to assert his own sense of duty and independence, she maintained a steady stream of letters, filled with updates, advice, reminders of the machinery still turning in his absence. Upon his return, he stepped back into a life that had never stopped being managed. By then, Robert Taylor had become one of the highest-paid actors in the world, yet the early pattern of reliance lingered. Gratitude blurred with habit, habit hardened into identity. The industry rewarded his composure, his beauty, his reliability, but somewhere beneath the polished surface lived the persistent question of whose success it truly was. Robert Taylor's life shimmered with acclaim. Audiences adored him, studios trusted him, photographers immortalized his profile from every angle. And yet his story remains a testament to a particular Hollywood alchemy, the transformation of vulnerability into marketable perfection, of partnership into quiet hierarchy. In the grand mythology of the era, he stands as both triumph and caution, a man elevated to icon status, shaped by forces as formidable as the spotlight itself, his image flawless, his voice carefully measured, forever intertwined with the woman who helped build him. Tony Curtis. The story of Tony Curtis and Janet Leigh is often told as a fairy tale about Hollywood's golden couple of the 50s. But if you look past the glossy magazine covers of the era, a very different drama unfolds. The drama of an ambitious yet utterly penniless young man who became a captive of his more powerful wife's success. When Bernard Schwartz, the son of poor Jewish immigrants from the Bronx, arrived in Los Angeles, he had nothing but striking good looks and a desperate will to survive. The studio bosses turned him into Tony Curtis, but it was Janet Leigh who transformed him into a social lion and a first-rank star. By the time they met, Janet was already an acclaimed diva, adored by audiences, and fully aware of how the machinery of Hollywood power worked. Tony, on the other hand, was little more than a pretty face with questionable origins and no polish to speak of. Janet did not simply marry him, she took him on, socially and financially, at the most fragile moment of his career, when it hung by a thread. In the early years of their union, she was the primary breadwinner, the engine pulling Curtis forward. She paid his bills, financed his training, built his wardrobe, and most crucially, purchased his entry ticket into the upper circles of Beverly Hills society. Janet Leigh's rule over Tony was gentle in form, but absolute in substance. She understood that he was an uncut diamond that had to be shaped and faceted to match her own brilliance. She oversaw his refinement down to the smallest detail. She taught him how to hold a fork properly, smoothed away his rough Bronx accent, and imposed upon him a social circle of influential producers and stars who saw him merely as Janet's husband. It was a gilded arrangement. Tony lived in a luxury he could never have afforded on his $75 a week. In those years, Hollywood openly laughed at the way Janet paraded her handsome husband around, buying him expensive sports cars and tailored suits so he would not look like a pauper beside her. Curtis would later admit in his memoirs that he often felt less like an independent man and more like a well-kept pet, a status accessory polished for display. Janet used her clout to secure him roles in her own films, effectively presenting him to studios as a condition of her participation. This carved a deep fissure in Tony's soul. He knew that his early success was not the fruit of his talent, but the result of a kind of benevolence from the woman who, in many ways, controlled his life. Being kept by Janet Leigh had a corrosive side effect. It bred in him a pathological insecurity and an endless hunger to prove his masculinity through affairs and relentless self-improvement. Janet, a perfectionist to the core, never let him forget who ruled the household and to whom he owed his ascent. She crafted the image of a flawless couple for the magazines, but inside that picture, Tony felt himself suffocating. Even when he finally became an international star after Some Like It Hot, Janet's shadow lingered. He felt compelled to repay again and again the investments she had made in him at the beginning. It was not only financial support, it was reputational capital. Janet created the myth of the happiest couple in Hollywood, and Tony was obliged to play his part, even as he grew to resent his dependence. He was a prisoner of an image built with Janet's money and to her exacting taste. When their marriage eventually collapsed under the weight of mutual grievances and infidelity, Tony Curtis discovered that despite his millions, he had never fully shed the complex of being the kept man that Janet Leigh had instilled in him during their years together.
His story stands as a vivid example of how even the most successful male career in Hollywood could begin with the position of a golden boy under the patronage of a powerful woman, and of the immense psychological price exacted for such a meteoric rise on borrowed strength. Curtis remained in the industry's memory as a self-made man, but those who knew the truth remembered that his first step toward fame had been paid for with Janet Leigh's checks and connections. She turned him from a drifter into a style icon, but in doing so, she took from him something far more elusive, his inner peace.
Guy Madison. If Robert Taylor's story was a testament to the formidable will of his benefactor, then the saga of Guy Madison and Helen Hayes became one of Hollywood's most ambitious and costly attempts to conjure genius where nature had supplied only a flawless exterior. Helen Hayes, crowned the First Lady of the American theater, possessed a mind of formidable clarity and taste refined on the stages of Broadway and in the corridors of power. Her reputation carried weight, from opening nights to White House receptions. Yet even towering intellects are not immune to aesthetic enchantment. When Guy Madison, a young sailor with a disarming smile and an athlete's easy grace, appeared briefly on screen, Hayes did not see merely a handsome newcomer. She saw potential in its rawest, most malleable form, a blank canvas, awaiting the steady, disciplined hand of a master. At a moment when her own stature was unassailable, but her private life yearned for renewed purpose, she took him under her wing. What followed resembled enlightened absolutism. Hayes assumed full responsibility for Madison's comfort and advancement, granting him a lifestyle fit for royalty while transforming his days into a relentless examination he could never quite pass. Her patronage was not casual generosity, it was a comprehensive investment in absence. She financed his refined apartments, his accounts at the finest New York restaurants, and a wardrobe designed to harmonize with her own cultivated image. Every expense, however, carried a hidden cost. For each check she signed, Guy paid in hours of exhausting instruction. She enlisted speech coaches to erase the trace of provincial inflection from his voice, dance instructors to instill grace, and respected drama teachers steeped in the Stanislavski method, determined to force into him a depth of feeling that would not naturally ignite. Hayes believed with the conviction of a visionary that discipline and resources could manufacture artistry. Through her influence, doors opened, roles materialized, opportunities arrived that others labored years to secure. Yet on screen, Madison often seemed less an actor than a beautifully carved statue, perfectly proportioned, immaculately lit, and curiously mute at the core. He lived within a golden cocoon, insulated from consequence. Obstacles vanished after a single decisive phone call from the First Lady. In private circles, whispers circulated. Madison was referred to as Miss Hayes's Galatea, an exquisite creation animated by her money and nothing more. The implication was clear. Without her intervention, he scarcely registered in the industry's ledger. What proved most corrosive was her refusal to allow him the dignity of failure. Every interview he gave bore her invisible signature. She edited, refined, and sometimes rewrote his words. She dictated his public associations and orchestrated his photographs. He became less a man than a living thesis, evidence that Helen Hayes could elevate anyone to stardom through sheer force of intellect and will. But audiences cannot be persuaded by patronage alone. As critical reviews turned harsh, commentators mocked his wooden performances, dismissing him as a handsome mannequin stuffed with Miss Hayes's money. Rather than retreat, Hayes doubled her efforts. Advertising budgets swelled. Banquets were staged to celebrate achievements that existed largely on paper. The enterprise assumed the character of a Sisyphean ascent, each push up the hill undone by the gravity of truth.
Madison, increasingly aware of the hollow center beneath the grandeur, grew restless. He came to resent the camera that exposed his limitations, the instructors who dissected his every gesture, and eventually the woman whose generosity felt like confinement. Accustomed to luxury he had not earned, he drifted into apathy. Alcohol, purchased with the same funds that sustained his lifestyle, dulled the persistent ache of inadequacy. The end unfolded with quiet inevitability. Once it became clear that the project would not yield a masterpiece, that Guy Madison would not ascend to greatness, Hayes's interest cooled with the detachment of a discerning collector discarding a forgery. Support receded, invitations diminished, the scaffolding vanished. Madison found himself exposed. No savings of consequence, no independent craft firmly rooted, no reputation unlinked from her name. Years under her protection had weakened his instinct for self-preservation. In Hollywood's memory, he lingered not as an artist in his own right, but as a former experiment, a beautiful footnote in a far grander narrative. His story stands as a sobering reminder that even the most cultivated patronage can become a form of quiet erasure when it seeks to substitute itself for identity. Guy Madison remained forever in Helen Hayes's shadow, a testament to her formidable ambition and to the unsettling truth that immense wealth can purchase the illusion of life, while leaving behind little more than faded hopes and a filmography echoing inside borrowed grandeur.
Rock Hudson. If the previous figures in our chronicle fell victim to the personal ambitions of individual divas, the story of Rock Hudson reveals how an entire industry can place a man on corporate allowance, transforming his life into a flawlessly engineered display window with nothing living left behind the glass. Rock Hudson, born Roy Scherer, Jr., was an ordinary truck driver from Illinois whose only initial assets were monumental height and a jaw carved as if from granite. His creator, and in effect his owner, was the notorious agent Henry Wilson. Yet a crucial role in maintaining his alibi and arranging his carefully managed domestic facade was played by Phyllis Gates, the woman the studio system assigned to be his devoted companion and keeper of the hearth. This was patronage designed to conceal the truth. In an era when the slightest whisper of improper orientation meant instant career death, Hudson became the captive of perhaps the most expensive and intricate contract in Hollywood history. His life was fully financed by Universal and Wilson, and in return he surrendered to them the right to direct his very soul. The tyranny imposed on Hudson took the form of preventive isolation. His upkeep included everything: lavish mansions, the newest automobiles, and an endless wardrobe meant to amplify his exaggerated masculinity. But behind the facade lay strict regulations. Rock was forbidden from visiting certain establishments, from forming friendships outside an approved list, and even from speaking in his natural voice. Wilson made him rehearse for hours, forcing his tone downward into a heroic register. The key act in this industrial arrangement was his marriage to Phyllis Gates in 1955. Phyllis, who had worked as Wilson's secretary, was not merely a wife, she was the operational manager of his private life, rewarded with status and full financial security. It was a marriage of mutual maintenance. Rock paid for Phyllis's silence and loyalty, and she, in turn, constructed for the press the illusion of the perfect American home. For Hudson, it was a tormenting existence staged as a perpetual performance. He lived in a house where every corner was prepared for surprise photo shoots from magazines like Photoplay or Modern Screen, which would show him cleaning the pool or reading the morning paper beside his loving wife. The studio covered their bills, their vacations, and their social appearances, yet Hudson remained under constant surveillance. Wilson and the studio executives created a gentle blackmail. They reminded Rock that everything he possessed, from gold cufflinks to the adoration of the public, had been granted by them and could be taken away in an instant should he dare to show independence or make a misstep. It was maintenance aimed at total uniformity. Roy Scherer was stripped of anything personal or vulnerable, leaving only Rock Hudson, the product that generated millions. The most devastating aspect of the story is that Hudson, by nature a kind and sensitive man, gradually began to believe he was incomplete without this supervision. He grew accustomed to thinking of his life as a collective enterprise in which he was merely the lead actor. Phyllis Gates, playing the role of devoted wife and maternal guardian, eventually demanded greater influence and greater compensation for her part in the deception. Their home became a gilded cage. The couple could scarcely endure one another's presence, yet they posed together on red carpets, beaming with meticulously rehearsed smiles. Maintaining Hudson cost the industry dearly, but it paid dividends many times over. For Rock himself, however, the price was incalculable. He lost the ability to form sincere relationships, living in constant fear of exposure. His masculinity became a commodity, bought and sold, and he knew he was loved not for who he was, but for the image his handlers had financed. Even after his marriage to Phyllis collapsed, the system did not release him. It simply assigned new custodians, continuing to preserve the image of the eternal bachelor under strict supervision. The story of Rock Hudson is the tragedy of a man sacrificed to his own perfection. He was Hollywood's most expensive-kept man, his days scheduled to the minute for the profit of others. He possessed everything one could dream of, yet he did not even own his own name. It was industrial servitude disguised as extraordinary success, where wealth served only to tighten the leash. Rock remains in history as a symbol of how the dream factory could purchase a life, hollow it out, and leave behind only a beautiful shell to serve the system's interests until the bitter end. His fate stands as a monument to an era when behind diamonds and camera flashes operated the harshest mechanisms of personal suppression, turning the screen's great heroes into powerless hostages of gilded contracts. Rock Hudson proved that one can be the king of Hollywood and still be the loneliest and most dependent man in the world. A man whose right to be himself was sold in exchange for decades of comfortable living in the shadow of another's will.
Alain Delon. The story of Alain Delon and Edith Piaf is a tale of two elemental forces colliding, of a young predator's icy beauty meeting the scorched earth passion of the woman the world called the Little Sparrow of Paris. In the mid-1950s, Delon was nothing, a deserter, a former butcher, a drifter with an angel's face and the instincts of a street fighter. He haunted the dubious bars of Pigalle, without money, connections, or any discernible future. It was there that Piaf noticed him. By then, she was already a living legend in France, armed with an almost supernatural instinct for talent and for the kind of male charisma that could be shaped, sharpened, and consumed by art. For Piaf, men had always been both inspiration and fuel. In Delon, she recognized not merely beauty, but potential, raw, volatile, and dangerously malleable. She did not simply introduce him to her circle, she assumed total responsibility for him. She resolved to transform this feral young man into a creature of refinement, a star worthy of the world's stage. Her dominance took the form of aesthetic discipline.
She understood that his face was a weapon, but a weapon without polish is wasted. He lacked manner, education, and the subtle codes of high society. Piaf paid for everything: his stays in expensive hotels, his first proper suits, the careful grooming that would erase the scent of the streets. She fed him, quite literally and figuratively, while subjecting him to long evenings of classical music, serious literature, and close observation of her own meticulous work on stage. This was patronage as expansion of identity. She wanted Delon to become her masculine projection, equally relentless, equally devoted to art, equally incandescent. Life under Piaf was a masterclass in surviving a gilded cage. She was a woman of extremes. In the morning she might shower him with gifts. By evening she could ignite a storm, shattering plates and reminding him of the gutter from which she had lifted him. She controlled his access to money, rarely handing him cash, but indulging any whim that unfolded within her line of sight. Dependence was not accidental, it was designed. His comfort hinged on her mood, his future on her favor. Through her immense influence, she placed him before directors and producers, effectively presenting him to the Parisian film elite as a discovery too dazzling to ignore. She paid for his presence at exclusive gatherings where he was expected to stand elegantly silent while she sang or argued about the fate of France. For the young Delon, accustomed to the brutal freedoms of the street, this was a humbling apprenticeship. He had become a salaried protégé, his destiny contingent on how convincingly he played the role of devoted companion to a towering diva. Piaf impressed upon him that without her he was nothing more than another beautiful face destined to fade in some forgotten dockside alley. The psychological tether she fashioned proved stronger than any financial bond. Yet Delon was not built to remain anyone's shadow. Absorbing everything her patronage offered, her sense of style, her discipline, her connections, he quietly constructed his own armor. He learned to navigate salons and studios with calculated charm. He used her name and resources to cultivate relationships that would one day stand independent of her. The most intricate tension between them arose when Piaf sensed his growing autonomy. Jealousy flared, restrictions tightened, threats of withdrawing support surfaced in moments of rage. She saw her creation evolving into something she could no longer command, a predator in his own right, and it frightened her. But the foundation she had financed was already too solid. Delon had learned her most vital lesson. In a world of power, survival belongs to those who take without apology. When his own star began to rise, he stepped away with a coolness that bordered on cruelty. The patronage that had once enclosed him became his launching pad. He left as decisively as he had once arrived, crossing a threshold not as a penniless deserter, but as a man prepared to conquer the screen. Their story is one of creation entwined with betrayal. Piaf sculpted him from street dust, underwriting every stage of his transformation. In doing so, she also extinguished whatever naive gratitude he might have possessed. Delon emerged from their union polished to perfection, ready for global acclaim, yet increasingly convinced that power outweighed attachment. For Piaf, he remained the most costly and painful of her endeavors, a living reminder that youth and beauty, once purchased, inevitably strain towards freedom the moment they recognize their own value. Delon carried with him the sheen and the dangerous self-assurance her money made possible, eventually becoming an icon of French cinema. Yet he also preserved a reputation for stepping past benefactors as effortlessly as he had once stepped across her doorway, a hungry nobody in search of fate. His ascent was paved with the checks of a great woman who loved him too fiercely to let him remain untouched, and, in trying to remake him, forged instead the cold screen deity the world would come to know.
Montgomery Clift. If the previous figures in our chronicle entered arrangements of patronage for the sake of ambition or out of weakness, the bond between Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor tells a different story, one in which the money and influence of a great woman became the only artificial lung keeping a dying soul alive. By the time they met on the set of A Place in the Sun, Montgomery Clift was already an icon of the emerging new Hollywood, an actor whose nervous magnetism and fragile masculinity had redefined male beauty on screen. Behind that luminous facade, however, lived a man torn apart by private demons, addictions, and an inability to accept his own nature. Elizabeth, though much younger, possessed the vitality and financial power that Clift lacked in order to survive the predatory world of studio contracts. Their relationship quickly outgrew the boundaries of friendship, evolving into a form of total, almost religious guardianship. Taylor effectively took Clift under her financial wing, but this was not patronage for sex or prestige. It was a desperate attempt by a great diva to ransom a genius's life from death itself. Elizabeth's dominion over Monty resembled a holy inquisition carried out in the name of salvation. She paid his endless psychiatric bills, secured the best doctors, and financed the kind of luxurious seclusion that allowed him to hide from the press. She became his guarantor before studios that, after his horrific car accident in 1956, no longer wished to risk dealing with an unstable actor. The accident marked the turning point when support became full-scale management of a life. When Clift crashed into a tree, it was Elizabeth who reached the scene first, pulling his broken teeth from his throat so he would not choke. From that day forward, she became his guardian angel with a bottomless wallet. Taylor used her status as the highest-paid actress in the world to issue ultimatums. She refused to sign multi-million-dollar contracts unless they included a place for Montgomery Clift. It was patronage through industrial blackmail. She covered his living expenses, his flights, his comforts, striving to create a vacuum around him where he could continue to create without worrying about how he would afford his next prescription or bottle. For Clift, it was both salvation and curse. He resented his dependence on Little Liz, as he called her, yet without her money and protection, he would have become a penniless outcast within months. Taylor built a system that shielded him from reality, but within that system, he could not escape the feeling of indebtedness, of being her costly project, the masterpiece she stubbornly refused to declare beyond repair. The tragedy lay in the fact that Elizabeth was trying to buy him time he no longer wished to inhabit. She spent staggering sums to sustain the illusion of his relevance, hiring people to watch over him and financing projects that were, in essence, underwritten by her. It was patronage in the service of an idea, the belief that beauty and talent could be resuscitated by love and capital. Clift became the golden prisoner of her devotion. He lived in interiors she selected and under the care of doctors she paid, fading into a shadow of himself. Taylor demanded nothing in return but his presence in her life, yet that very selflessness weighed on him more heavily than any command. He understood that his existence had become a charitable act performed by the greatest woman of the era, and that realization only hastened his self-destruction. Elizabeth built a dome of rose satin and bank guarantees around him, but inside it the air grew thinner by the day.
The story of Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor stands as the most noble and at the same time the darkest example of patronage in Hollywood. She did not wish to possess him, as others might have done. She wanted him simply to exist. Yet in a world where everything carries a price, the cost of his survival proved too high for his own sense of dignity. Clift died in 1966 from what critics later called the longest suicide in cinema history, and throughout those years, Elizabeth Taylor remained his chief creditor, his advocate, and his financial shield. She proved that even the greatest fortune in the world cannot mend a broken soul, though it can transform its agony into a spectacle of luxury. Monty endures in memory as Hollywood's most fragile and most beloved kept man, a man whose final years were financed by the vast love of a woman who tried to outwit fate itself, preserving him for eternity in the golden frame of her boundless power and wealth.
Richard Burton. If Montgomery Clift's story unfolded like a quiet elegy of rescue, then the bond between Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton erupted into the loudest, most extravagant spectacle of mutual dependence the modern celebrity world had ever seen, a romance in which luxury became both glue and solvent. When they met on the set of Cleopatra, Burton was widely regarded as the greatest stage actor of his generation, a spiritual heir to Laurence Olivier, a man whose voice seemed forged for Shakespeare's verse. Taylor, however, was no mere leading lady. She was an institution unto herself, a woman whose $1 million salary had already redrawn Hollywood's financial map. She was spectacle, capital, and myth rolled into one. For Burton, the son of a Welsh miner, the affair was not simply romantic, it was seismic. He stepped into a universe where diamonds were exchanged like calling cards and private jets waited as casually as taxis. Taylor did not merely love him, she enveloped him in an atmosphere of such relentless opulence that returning to the austere discipline of serious theater began to feel almost unreal. Her dominion did not resemble tyranny in the crude sense, it was intoxication. She transformed their life into an ongoing coronation. There was the yacht Kalitzma drifting through Mediterranean light. There were endless European residences, suites prepared in advance, tables set with rare wine. There were jewels, legendary acquisitions that made headlines around the world, the La Peregrina pearl, the Krupp diamond, treasures Burton often purchased with earnings from films that cast him as much for their combined magnetism as for his individual brilliance. It was a form of sustenance through spectacle. Taylor became the sun around which money and attention revolved. Burton, despite his formidable intellect and talent, found his ambitions slowly dissolving in the haze of champagne and flashbulbs. The man who once longed to devote himself to Hamlet now lived as half of a phenomenon, an essential but inseparable extension of the most photographed woman on earth. Their life together resembled an endless celebration, yet beneath the glitter lay an unspoken hierarchy. Taylor's earning power and global fame set the scale. Burton's pub bills, his mounting gambling debts, his appetite for excess, these were absorbed, often invisibly, by the vast machinery surrounding her. The ease of it all began to dull him. Struggle, once the engine of his craft, was replaced by access. Scripts arrived, contracts materialized. The fight that sharpens an artist's edge gradually softened into indulgence. What made their union so destructive was not cruelty, but complicity. Taylor adored his voice, his erudition, the grandeur he carried into a room, yet she also built a world so comfortable, so intoxicating, that the thought of retreating to a lean London stage, free but comparatively modest, seemed almost masochistic.
It was a golden suffocation. Everything he desired, from rare first editions to cases of fine whiskey, appeared at a gesture. Burton rebelled in cycles, drunken outbursts, public quarrels, dramatic departures, but he returned again and again to the gravitational pull of her wealth and her will. In private writings he could be brutally self-aware, casting himself as a courtier in silk, yet pride alone could not overpower the seduction of a life where empires were purchased in velvet boxes. Taylor did not need to command him outright. She acquired almost effortlessly his time, his voice, and eventually portions of his legend. He became an indispensable chapter in her mythology, a brilliant actor whose image grew inseparable from the gleam of jewelry store receipts and transatlantic headlines. Their story is less about villainy than about scale. Material abundance, when vast enough, can erode discipline more efficiently than poverty ever could. Burton became one of the most extravagantly maintained men in Hollywood, a genius who traded a measure of artistic solitude for a seat within a diamond-studded saga. Taylor was not a tyrant in any conventional sense. She was simply too luminous, too wealthy, too culturally immense for partnership to remain balanced. She sustained him like an emperor, yet an emperor without a kingdom is merely a performer in borrowed regalia. Burton died with his Shakespearean promise only partially fulfilled, remembered as much for the tempestuous spectacle of Burton and Taylor as for the grandeur of his verse. It was a golden cage on a planetary scale. For every pound spent, a fragment of artistic austerity slipped away. What endured most clearly was the voice, that extraordinary instrument, echoing across films and interviews, resonant and magnificent, carrying within it both triumph and the faint reverberation of something that luxury, however dazzling, could never quite replace.
Clark Gable. If Richard Burton's story was a dazzling flash of diamonds, Clark Gable's path in the arms of Joan Crawford resembled a cold assembly line designed to manufacture the perfect product. In the early 30s, Gable was not the king of Hollywood. He was a rough, unpolished boy from Ohio with protruding ears, bad teeth, and the manners of a lumberjack, struggling to find his place among the grand illusions of the silver screen. By then, Joan Crawford was already an anointed screen goddess, a woman who had built herself from the ground up, rising from waitress to style icon. She possessed not only an infallible instinct for success, but the iron grip of a predator who sees potential where others see only mud. When she noticed Gable on set, she did not simply fall in love, she recognized an investment, a project that with the proper infusion of money and willpower could yield planetary returns. She took him under her protection at a moment when MGM was still wavering over whether to renew his contract. Crawford's tyranny over Gable was the tyranny of perfection through force. She assumed responsibility for his upkeep during the period when his pay barely covered the rent on a shabby room. She financed his visits to the finest dentists who crafted the smile that would become legendary. She compelled him to work with voice coaches to scrub away his provincial drawl. She paid the tailors who wrapped his powerful frame in suits that transformed a brute into an aristocrat. Gable's maintenance under Crawford was a covert act of social engineering. While the press celebrated his virility, Joan, behind the doors of her mansion, trained him like a pedigreed hound. She instructed him how to enter a room, how to hold a glass, what to say, and more importantly, what not to say in the presence of studio executives. Clark lived at her expense not only materially, but professionally. Joan leveraged her immense influence over Louis B. Mayer to secure roles for Gable that had originally been intended for others. It was patronage contingent on absolute submission to her taste. Crawford was constructing a king from raw materials, and Gable, ambitious to the core, accepted her help. He understood that without Joan's money and protection, he would remain a secondary player in low-budget westerns. Yet he paid that support with the surrender of his own voice. Joan might telephone him in the middle of the night, demanding an account of whom he had dined with, or stage a public scene if he dared assert even the smallest independence. She had invested too much to allow him to belong to himself. For Gable, it was a humiliating duality. On screen, he embodied the alpha male. In life, he was a protégé who could not pick up the check for his own dinner without the approval of his Joan. The most cynical aspect of the story was that Crawford regarded Clark as her property even when the studio required them to conceal their affair for the sake of image. She built a system in which Gable was surrounded by her people, her money, her influence. It was golden patronage aimed at long-term gain. Joan knew that once Gable became the #1 star, her contribution would be impossible to ignore. But she miscalculated one thing. Having absorbed every lesson in luxury and style that Crawford financed, Gable began to chafe under her despotism. Once he tasted real power and commanding salaries, he sought to sever the threads with which Joan had tethered him to her purse. What followed was a protracted war of ambitions. Crawford never missed an opportunity to remind him who had paid for his dental crowns and his first tuxedos. She did not forgive debts, especially those settled with her youth and her professional capital. Gable became the king, yet he carried to the end of his life the mark of a man made by a woman. That awareness drove him to perform his masculinity with even greater insistence, as though bravado could erase the memory of being kept by the formidable Crawford. The story of Clark Gable and Joan Crawford reveals how behind the glittering career of cinema's most masculine idol may stand the cold calculus of a powerful patroness. Clark Gable was Joan's most successful financial project, living proof that even charisma can be purchased if one knows where to invest. He became the idol of millions, yet behind him lingered the shadow of the woman who once paid his admission to the major leagues, shaping a rough block into a gleaming diamond. This patronage was an act of ambitious creation, with Gable as clay in the sculptor's hands. And though he ultimately slipped those bonds, his triumph remained a monument to an era when even kings began by accepting checks from women who chose to play at being creators.
Marlon Brando. The story of Marlon Brando and Stella Adler is more than a tale of student and mentor. It is the chronicle of how a formidable woman from a theatrical dynasty effectively adopted, civilized, and fully financed a young rebel who, without her intellectual and material protection, might well have vanished into obscurity, or worse. When 19-year-old Brando arrived in New York, he was chaos incarnate. Dirty fingernails, worn jeans, a habit of sleeping on floors, and little comprehension of how the civilized world functioned. Adler, sovereign of her theatrical Olympus, recognized in him not merely a promising pupil, but a primitive force. Such force, she understood, had to be cultivated and shielded. Left unattended, it would burn itself out on trivialities. Her authority over him was not crude domination, but the rule of high culture backed by an open line of credit. She moved him into her elegant home, folding him into her household as a kind of gilded prodigy whose expenses were settled without interrogation. Adler knew Brando was an instrument of rare sensitivity. To make him resonate, she believed, he required a setting he could never have afforded on his own. She paid for his meals, his clothing, even his minor debts, constructing around him a vacuum of security in which he could afford to be erratic, insolent, unmanageable. Her patronage was both intellectual and material. She did not merely hand him money, she purchased his time and directed his attention toward the pillars of classical art. Museum visits, books, introductions to New York's cultural elite, worlds far removed from the modest background he had known, were placed within his reach. This was support with a civilizing mission. While Brando performed disdain for bourgeois values in public, he accepted without hesitation the privileges that came with being Adler's chosen protégé.
Thanks to her, he was spared the grind that consumed so many young actors, waiting tables, hauling crates, scraping by. Freed from the daily humiliation of survival, he preserved the inner defiance and audacity that would later define him. Yet the cost was steep. Privacy evaporated. Adler monitored his associations, guarded him from outside influences, and treated him as her most precious enterprise. She invested not only her knowledge, but her resources, and she expected total devotion to the altar of art she had built. The paradox was striking. Brando, who publicly disdained authority, depended in private on Adler's approval and her checkbook. She created an environment in which he could be a rebel under supervision, his defiance curated, his excesses rationalized. It was golden patronage tinged with something almost Oedipal. Adler became mentor, mother, and financial steward in one. She used her name to open doors to prestigious theaters and paid his restaurant bills even when he behaved like a provocateur, secure in the knowledge that the first lady of the stage stood behind him. Brando grew accustomed to the role of the costly dependent who could scorn the very well from which he drank, confident that his benefactor would reinterpret misconduct as genius. That arrangement nurtured the startling self-assurance that would later both intimidate and mesmerize producers. He understood that his worth had been validated not only by talent, but the level of cultivation and comfort instilled in him from the start. Their alliance reveals how a great diva can deploy her resources to cultivate a titan who ultimately outgrows her. Adler effectively purchased Brando's right to singularity, sparing him the indignity of scrambling for subsistence and granting him immediate entry into artistic elite circles. He became an icon, but the foundation of that icon was laid in Adler's living room, under her roof, according to her principles. Her patronage was at once supremely generous and deeply possessive. She fashioned a masterpiece that would belong to the world, yet one that always carried traces of her touch and the quiet authority of her support. Brando emerged a king, but somewhere within he remained the young man whose rebellion had been carefully financed by a woman who understood the true cost of freedom and who knew how to turn dependence itself into an art form.
Laurence Olivier. The story of Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh is a majestic and at the same time painful drama of male pride laid upon the altar of a woman's success, a woman who became the face of an entire era. In London's theatrical circles, Olivier was regarded as the heir to the great tragedians, a prince of the stage whose technique was immaculate and whose ambition knew no bounds. Yet worldwide fame came to him not through his Shakespearean soliloquies, but through the blinding, almost supernatural triumph of his wife as Scarlett O'Hara. From that moment on, their union ceased to be a partnership of equals. It became a complex system in which Vivien was the primary economic and media asset, and Laurence her brilliant yet financially dependent consort. Vivien Leigh's tyranny over Olivier was the tyranny of involuntary superiority. After the release of Gone with the Wind, she became the highest-paid and most sought-after actress on the planet, her fees eclipsing Laurence's earnings many times over. She assumed responsibility for their lavish lifestyle, purchasing estates and settling bills that Olivier, for all his theatrical acclaim, simply could not afford. It was patronage at once prestigious and exhausting. Laurence lived in settings bought by Vivien and slept on sheets paid for by her Hollywood contracts, a circumstance that for a man shaped by conservative British values felt like a slow castration of the spirit. Olivier's dependence on Vivien took the form of enforced co-authorship.
Lee, a woman of boundless generosity and equally boundless fragility, used her wealth to finance their joint theatrical ventures. She effectively purchased the right to perform alongside Lawrence, pouring her vast earnings into productions that, without her name and her money, would never have reached the stage. For Olivier, this was a curse. He understood that he was mounting productions not as a free creator, but as a man whose budgets were underwritten by his wife's popularity. In Hollywood corridors, he was often perceived as the husband of the great Vivien Leigh, a label that drove him to fury. Leigh paid for their endless travels, their receptions for the elite, and even his attempts to establish himself in cinema, serving as a guarantor of his bankability. It was golden patronage wrapped in love and devotion, yet beneath it lay a stark fact. Vivien was the sovereign of their shared empire and Lawrence its administrator, his career inseparable from his wife's financial might. His masculine identity was methodically eroded by the knowledge that each of his triumphs stood in the shadow of her colossal fortune. The most destructive element of this story was that Leigh used her resources to bind Olivier to her unstable psyche. She created a world in which he was obliged to be her protector, physician, and partner all at once, while remaining, in essence, on her account. It was a form of psychological captivity reinforced by millions of pounds. Lawrence grew accustomed to the level of comfort Vivien provided, to the grandeur of Notley Abbey, to servants, to a luxury that affirmed his status as king of the theatre. Yet he knew that without Vivien, the ivory tower would crumble. Patronage turned him into a man torn between resentment of his dependence and fear of losing the gilded life she had bestowed upon him. When Vivien's mental health began to deteriorate, Olivier found himself trapped. He was bound to care for the woman who sustained him financially, feeling his own creative energy drained by the management of her endless crises. It was a union in which the actress's money became chains for the actor, transforming their life into a prolonged requiem for her former glory, a requiem he paid for with his autonomy. The story of Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh concludes our chronicle of power and dependence. Olivier ultimately broke free from the golden cage, founding the National Theatre and achieving financial independence of his own. Yet the years spent as a kept protégé under Vivien left an indelible mark. He carried forever the cool detachment and hunger for authority that were his answer to years cast in a secondary role. Vivien Leigh purchased Hollywood and purchased the right to stand beside the greatest actor of her time, but the cost of that acquisition proved too high for them both. Olivier became a legend, yet part of the foundation of his greatness was paved with the earnings of Scarlett O'Hara, a woman who loved him so fiercely she nearly suffocated him with her wealth and her fame. Their union remains a grand monument to an era when even the most gifted men could become hostages to female triumph, proving that in a world of vast fortunes and vast ambitions, the right to lead is often bought at the price of another's submission and a loyalty paid in gold.
Drawing a final line beneath this gallery of fractured destinies and gilded contracts, we are forced to admit that Hollywood's golden age was not only an era of great art, but also a time when power refined human dependency into something almost elegant. The stories of 10 legendary actors, from Robert Taylor to Laurence Olivier, lay bare the cold mechanics of an industry where male independence was often bartered for proximity to someone else's radiance. These alliances were never merely marriages or affairs. They were carefully engineered systems of patronage in which celebrated women became investors, architects, and wardens of male potential. We have seen how Barbara Stanwyck and Joan Crawford polished away provincial roughness in their protégés, replacing it with refinement purchased outright. We have watched how Elizabeth Taylor could transform formidable tragedians into glittering extensions of her own legend. To be sustained by a powerful woman in that era was, in many cases, a pact written in invisible ink. Access to master tailors, private clubs, and leading roles came swiftly, but so did the quiet surrender of autonomy. A name might remain on the marquee, yet the will behind it could slowly erode. For some, like Alain Delon or Marlon Brando, such patronage became a brutal launching pad, a lesson in power absorbed and later wielded with ruthless fluency. For others, like Rock Hudson or Montgomery Clift, the gilded enclosure turned into a site of slow psychological erosion, where glossy magazine smiles concealed private dread and the terror of failing to justify the investment. These biographies remind us that, in the so-called dream factory, money and influence were never bound by gender. Women who ascended to the summit learned to deploy the same instruments of control once monopolized by studio moguls. Lovers became curated projects, companions became assets, comfort itself became leverage. Behind the immaculate screen image of every king or hero, there often stood the silhouette of a formidable patron, someone who paid for the first tuxedo, the improved smile, and the entree into rooms where history was negotiated over champagne. The glow of those 10 careers still dazzles, yet it carries a faint aftertaste of dependence, the unspoken toll demanded for entry onto Olympus. In the end, Hollywood's most extravagant luxury was never diamonds or yachts. It was the rare privilege of belonging to oneself, untouched by the weight of a benefactor's checkbook resting just beyond the shoulder.